May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated, and I welcome those who are watching by live stream. It's great to see all of you this morning. A number of years ago, I was traveling with one of my bishops to a church meeting. It was in the days when you arrive at the airport, when you still had to check in at the desk. So we walked into the terminal, went towards the desk. Parenthetically, let me say that we were sporting big rings. He had a big bishop's ring on his right hand, and I had a college ring with a nifty little baseball insignia on it. Thought that was pretty special. And so we were walking into the terminal and we went to the counter, and the check-in agent then lifted her head and noticed our rings. And she exclaimed, "Are those Super Bowl rings?" I'm just mildly offended that you're laughing. The bishop then said to her, "Do these look like Super Bowl bodies?" I then said to her, "You know, his ring is because he's an Episcopal bishop. And my ring is a college ring with a baseball insignia." She said back, "Isn't that cute?" Sometimes it's tough for us to break through in who we are and what we do to find our identity and to live into our purpose. It started early for most of us, and sometimes unsuspectingly, we say things or think things. Remember when we were children, we used to say a jingle, usually when we were on the playground. It went something like this: rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief, doctor, lawyer, merchant, chief. Or if you were particularly pugnacious, you would say Indian chief. You know, we used the jingle to really choose up sides or to count our marbles or to decide who gets the cookies on the plate. But the last one that you named is the what you would become. You didn't quite know in that age what you would become: rich man or a poor man, a beggar man or a thief, a high-powered lawyer on Wall Street, or someone standing on the corner with a tin cup. We weren't quite sure what destiny was going to serve us when we were young, but in the middle of that old jingle was not just a question, but the question. What are you and I going to do with our life? This gift we've been given, and that the scriptures declare that we have a purpose, and that in that purpose you and I would then make a difference for God and for God's world. That we would roll up our sleeves and open up our heart and offer our gifts in such a way that we would finish our days and we would look back and say, "I am satisfied. I have lived into my purpose." It wasn't just a question. It is the question. I'm daring enough to believe that even a few months ago at turning 66, that it is still the question. It's not only the question that we raise for ourselves when we're coming along to adulthood, but also a question we ask in retirement and everything in between. How am I going to spend my life for the sake of God and God's world? It's not always an easy enterprise, by the way, this sense of call. You'll remember that Isaiah declared, "The word of the Lord," or God's presence, "came to me in the year that King Uzziah died." Peter and James and John received their calling in today's gospel text, which Clay just read. They received their calling after a full night of no fish. Ministry begins, doesn't it, in the year that King Uzziah died, or in the year that Pearl Harbor was bombed, or in the year that JFK was assassinated. Ministry begins in the year that the Twin Towers were attacked. Ministry begins when something in us was attacked. Ministry begins when someone in our family died or when something went south. Our calling begins at a time of challenge, in other words. It's not always easy. Desmond Tutu reports that when he was 9 years old, he lived in the worst poverty in South Africa, in Soweto. One day at 9, he was just playing outside the house with his mom sitting in a chair, and unsuspecting to them, the Reverend Trevor Huddleston was coming down the road. Trevor Huddleston was known to everyone. He was the local Anglican priest. He had his nice linen suit on, his clerical collar, walked just past the Tutu house, recognized that Mrs. Tutu was sitting there in a chair, and stopped, turned to her, and then bowed, entered into a conversation, and then took off his hat. Desmond Tutu reports later that was a radical event. No white man in South Africa would ever talk to another black woman in their culture. And yet the Reverend Trevor Huddleston not only stopped and engaged his mother in conversation, bowed to her, and then removed his hat, a sign of dignity and respect. Desmond Tutu reports that even at 9 years old, he said to himself, I want to be one of those. I want to be an Anglican priest so that the rest of my life I can show love and dignity and respect to all people. He learned that calling one day just by happenstance when Trevor Huddleston walked by. How about you? How about me? We receive some nudges along the way, don't we? Little voices, little promptings to get moving on the purpose of our life. But this word call, it's a churchy word, isn't it? It's a word that clergy use. I say I was called to be the interim rector at Bethesda-by-the-Sea. But does the president of Chase Bank see it that way? Or how about the person who runs Northrop Grumman? Or how about the janitor at the local high school or the social worker down in Fort Lauderdale? Do they see it the same way? Whenever church people talk, they talk about calling. But it can become thin, this idea, almost trite. A number of years ago, I was literally called by one of our parishioners to do a rural funeral at a way out funeral home, 2 hours from my home, in the middle of eastern North Carolina, near Spivey's Corner. I had done hundreds of funerals, but I didn't see this coming. I walked into the funeral home, and I looked in the front, and there was the casket. Half of it was open, which we usually do not do. The other half was covered in total white carnations. And there was a little powder blue princess phone on the top of the casket with the receiver dangling off the front. And there was a big sign in black in the middle of the white carnations, and it said, Jesus called. This business of calling can become thin. If you ask the Apostle Peter, though, about a sense of call by the Sea of Galilee, he would say, oh, it's deep and it's real and it has some cost. There's 3 actions that happen in our gospel text that I don't want us to miss that relate to our sense of purpose, our sense of call. The first is you'll notice that after all night of not catching a thing, then Jesus summons them, now go and launch out. That's the first action. Launch out. It is the first creative action of a call. You and I have a tendency to want to stay on the dock, don't we? Keep the boat tied up. Don't take many risks. Take a few steps back away from the water. That's our normal posture. And yet Jesus comes along and says, I want you to launch out. What would that look like in your life and mine? I've done a lot of boating and canoeing and kayaking. Maybe some of you have too. To take in the full adventure of boating, kayaking, and canoeing, you have to launch out, don't you? There's a lot of boats over in Lake Worth, and I see a lot of people shining a lot of things, cleaning a lot of boats, and a lot of them are tied up, I have to say. Jesus wants us to untie them and launch out into the water. The second action that Jesus summons for the disciples and us is he says, I want you to go out into the deep and let down your nets. That's also a challenging appeal of Jesus. You see, it's a lot easier to boat near the shore, isn't it? In the shallow area. If something goes wrong, you could even dive off your boat and swim to shore. It's much riskier, of course, to set out into the deep water. Set out into the deep water, he says to Peter, and then let down your nets. Again, I ask, what would that look like in your life and mine? It might mean to risk more, to give more, love more. It might mean that you and I have to ask for help, learn some new skills, take on some new challenges, to offer our talents for the sake of others. Set out into the deep, he said, and drop down your nets in generosity and giving. The third action that Jesus summons them is they left behind their fishing business and followed him. They left behind that which they were presently doing, who they presently were, and they lived into something new. They took on something afresh. Again, I ask, what would it sound like in your life and mine to fill in the blank? You left blank and went and followed in the way. I left behind resentment and followed in the way. I left behind anger and frustration and followed in the way. I left behind impatience. I left behind possessiveness, regret. I left behind that sour relationship or that which was dry and frail. I left behind a stale job. I left behind a painful memory. I left behind an addiction to follow in the way. How would you fill in the blank? I left behind blank and followed in the way. If there's one thing that captures us about the heroes and heroines of the faith, is they were able to leave behind that which was not life-giving and to take on that which was of the purpose of their life. A number of years ago, it was a normal day in the life of Sally. Sally was a friend, a former vestry member of the church where I served as the rector. She was doing a very normal thing. She was flying through Atlanta Airport, and she was going to catch her next flight. She was sitting in the Delta terminal. She was minding her own business, listening in for her flight to be announced. In the days when we used to read magazines, she actually had a couple of them. While she waited, she opened her Ladies' Home Journal. Remember those? A Ladies' Home Journal. She just happened to open it up at a particular page with the feature article. The feature article was written by someone who was nearly her age from another city in the South. And the article was about starting a culinary school. She took some interest, read the article, registered the information, didn't think much of it. Her flight was called, put her magazine away, and went on her way home. A couple days later, she reported, it began to gnaw on her. She began to think about this article. She went back and read it again. Sally had an MBA. She was smart. She could run a Fortune 500 company. She was then raising her children, however, but she was ready, you see. She was ready to launch out. And what I learned was she was ready to launch out into the deep. And she was ready to let down her nets. And she was ready to leave some things so she could take on something new. She thought, it's exactly what our community needs. A culinary school for those who don't have a skill, those who are vocation-less, those who need a good-paying job. So she set about this force. She knew a lot of people in our city. As I say, she was a former vestry member of our church. She was well connected. Well, 3 years later, it was my great privilege to join her and a whole cadre, including the mayor, at a dedication where there was a big blue ribbon in front of the door that we cut. We said some prayers, and we opened Project Host. Sally was called. She felt a nudge. She exercised her purpose and her talents. She gave of herself monumentally to this Project Host. A call comes at night, or we have an email that comes across the screen, or we open up a ladies' home journal, or we hear the choir sing a magnificent Psalm 138, or we meet up with a friend for coffee, or we're just out there minding our own business, and something happens. We get a tickle, we get a nudge, someone is moving us. Like Isaiah in the temple, when the seraph went and took a hot burning coal and touched his tongue, and we believe also his heart. And he said, "Here am I, send me." Could it be that you and I would have that same prompting, that some version of the seraph would fly our way, the Spirit would touch our heart, and we would say with Isaiah, "Here I am, send me." Amen.